Chapter 9. The sun had risen into the clear sky when the coach stopped for Bullet by his mailbox at 6:45. They drove on down to the town dock where the school bus waited. Bullet climbed into the yellow bus and took his usual seat, right front by the window. The rest of the team trickled in, one after the other, waiting until the last minute before climbing onto the bus. The coach checked them in, calling out names and making marks on his clipboard. They were down to 3 Negroes, Bullet noticed. One of them Tammer, of course. The Negroes moved on to the back of the bus, where all 3 could sit together. The meet was at a school 3 hours north, up in Queen Anne's County. Bullet slouched down in his seat, relaxed. He could hear Nerves and the rest of the team, sitting behind him. He could see Nerves in the coach's body, hunched by the opposite window. Bullet wasn't tense. He was going to run. There was nothing to make him tense about that. He didn't remember the course. He never remembered a course from one year to the next. He didn't want to. He wouldn't jog it either, although that was how you prepared for a cross-country run. You were supposed to jog over the course an hour or more before you ran it and plan your approaches and learn the obstacles. Bullet never tried to study a course. There was no way to train your reflexes or find out how quick your judgments were. That was the way if what you wanted to do was win. As time passed, the bus behind him alternated between uneasy silences, quick low conversation, and loud nervous joking. Bullet never turned around, didn't measure the distance by passing towns or intersecting highways, didn't think, didn't look out the window, didn't do anything. When they arrived, the bus pulled into a big parking lot behind a low modern school building stretched out along the top of the hill, with the windows along most of the walls. The building was locked for the weekend, but the gym was open. The opposing team poured out through the broad doors as the Crisfield Warriors went in to change. This was a private school, the Acorn School. It had a team of coaches, a head of track, and 2 assistants. All of the competitors looked alike except for the colors of their shorts. The Warriors wore red, the Acorn team blue. All had on white tank tops with numbers. Bullet followed the mass of moving bodies to the field hanging back. The oval track lay in a kind of meadow between 2 gentle hills. A white board fence surrounded it. From the top of a rise of land, watching people spread out over and around the field, Bullet picked out the brown rectangle that was the long jump pit, the circle from which the javelin would be thrown, the tall pole vault posts, and the shorter high jump posts. A pile of white hurdles lay piled up beside the gateway to the track. A couple of long white benches were set out for spectators and equipment. The cross-country path led up through mown grass over the opposite hill to disappear into the sky. The sky shone deep blue. White clouds, broad and lazy, drifted across it. Bullet stood watching. The mass broke up into smaller groups, bending and stretching in exercises. The coaches, 3 blue windbreakers and 1 red one, moved among the groups. 2 officials stood by the starting line on the track in black and white striped shirts and black shorts. From a distance, the competitors looked like animals turned loose into a field, guided by herdsmen into positions on the lush meadow while the officials oversaw the whole operation. From a distance, the whole scene looked ordered, designed, completed. If he could paint, Bullet thought, this was something that would make a painting, in oil to catch the quality of color the clear air brought out. The rich green of the grass, the brown of track and pit so perfectly brown it looked like it had to be some other substance, not really earth at all, maybe gold, and the figures of the young men lying on the grass with their fingers locked behind their necks, muscles pulling effortlessly up or running in place with high lifted knees. But he didn't paint, couldn't even draw, and didn't want to. He went down the slope to find out when his events were. The coach moved around, checking up, checking in, encouraging and advising. He handed Bullet the clipboard. On the top of the papers was the mimeograph sheet listing the order of events. Cross-country, as usual, came near the end. As always, the relay race came last. When he was a 9th grader, Bullet ran with the relay team. The coach had tried to get him to run sprints, too, but he refused. He was fast enough, but he didn't like running on the track in the lines. After one season, Bullet could decide what events he would enter, and he refused to run in the relay anymore. "Tillerman, you time the sprints," the coach told him. Bullet hung the stopwatch around his neck and moved on along the fence to stand at the 100-meter mark. After a while, the finish tape was set up across the 8 lanes of track, and he saw 8 runners move into position, 4 pairs of blue shorts, 4 red. They crouched, bodies coiled into position, heads down. In unison, they raised their bodies up to the rest on fingertips and toes, and then, a split second later, at the sound of the blank being fired, they sprang off their marks. Bullitt started the stopwatch at the same time. 15 seconds later, it was all over, and the 8 runners were going back to their coaches to check times and hear advice. Bullitt filled in the places and the times for the runners, 4, 6, 8, 7, 8. The times ranged from 13.1 to 14.8 seconds. The winning time was 11.9. A little kid, probably a 9th grader, skinny and fast, who headed for the finish line as if that was his only hope in the whole world. Bullitt moved up to the 200-meter mark halfway around the track. 2 members of the Crisfield team were running both of these races, which put them at a disadvantage. But they were strong starters, which gave them some chance, in those leagues, of competing. Not that day, though. The Acorn runners had been well coached, had trained hard. Crisfield took the bottom 4 positions in the 200. Bullitt wrote down the results, then moved to stand near the group by the starting line to time the 400-meter, once around the track. There, waiting for the gun to sound, his finger poised over the stopper, he could watch the start close up. 8 tense bodies, each in position at the far right edge of the lane, waited. The gun went. He pushed down. The runners were away. Into the first straight they were bunched. Acorn was running that little guy again, and he pulled out ahead, legs pumping, head slewing as his shoulders swung, setting the pace fast. At the turn, about halfway around, he fell apart, dropping rapidly back, his legs loose and awkward. The 3 other Acorn runners started to move forward at that time. The field stretched way out. Bullitt watched. Only one Crisfield runner could stay near the leading pack, and he trailed them by increasing distances. Watching, noting the strategy employed by the opponents, Bullitt wondered why the Crisfield runners couldn't keep up. His legs were strong enough. He had the shoulders and chest to go with him. He marked the time across the line, 55 seconds, and then several seconds later the 3 remaining warriors. The little guy stumbled last across the line, his face furious, ashamed. Acorn's timer, whose long arms and legs marked him as probably a vaulter, looked over at Bullitt. His eyes sparkled, then he muted his enthusiasm. They finally decided to put some money into track, he said. Our youngest coach, with the blonde crew cut, he ran for West Point. The 800. He knows what he's doing. Tactics, too. He waited for Bullitt's reply. Bullitt didn't say anything, just moved off to report in. He couldn't stand these good sport types. The team had been well trained, and they ran better. Why apologize? The other boy fell into step with him. You're S. Tillerman, aren't you? Yeah. My name's Hurley, George Hurley. So what? I've heard about you. I'm pleased to meet you. I don't run cross-country. Buzz off, why don't you? You've been state champion for 2 years, haven't you? Bullitt nodded, wishing the guy would get off his heels. He walked faster. He couldn't stand these guys, with their good sport faces and rich kid haircuts and professional quality track shoes. Are you going to try for nationals this year? Hurley asked. No, Bullitt said, letting all the anger that was building up out in his voice. The kid finally got the message. Bullitt entered the times and returned the stopwatch. The coach moved to the center of the track where the long jump pit had been dug. Bullitt stayed back at his distance. Long jump always took a while, as jumpers were eliminated after a couple of rounds. Bullitt watched the jumpers, the near sprint up the approach, the spring into the air, and the mid-air kick to gain distance, then the heels digging into the sand to land at farthest extension. You could see in the long jump how the body worked, muscles and bones together, how the machinery was put together. You could see the muscles tense for the spring, then hang loose for a second before gathering themselves up around the bones to push forward, and finally stretch out, extended along the lengths of the leg bones, and the arm bones too. All the bones with their weight and their length worked with the muscles to pull the jumper's body forward. Tammer was their best long jumper, but he was landing with his feet tucked under his knees, using his ankles to take the shock of landing. He only got a 4th, and Bullitt saw the coach move up to talk to him. Bullitt threw the javelin, which he didn't mind. It gave his chest and arms some warm-up, and he liked the dead-stop feeling all along his skeleton as he landed on his break foot and swung the throwing arm around, picking up the shock of the stop to add to the force behind his throw. A couple of the Crisfield throwers were disqualified for overstepping the throwing line, but Bullitt never made that mistake. His reflexes were too good. He got a second with 115 feet. He guessed that none of Acorn's hotshot coaches was a javelin man. 115 wouldn't even place you in most meets. The morning went on. They ran 2 middle-distance races, then the 400-meter hurdles. Bullitt watched the hurdle race with some interest, leaning on the top rail of the fence, the sun warm on his head and shoulders. The Acorn team took the hurdles higher than they had to, almost doing a split in midair over the bar. They were awkward about it, and sometimes even came down on top of the hurdle, but they got height that way. The Warriors, except for Tammer, just ran over the fences, which were so low in these leagues that they looked all right. Tammer, however, approached each jump as the opponents did, but with more coordination, as if he knew what he was doing. He took a good lead, his heavy thighs moving him well for the 30-odd yards between jumps, always taking off from his right foot with no break in stride. Bullitt watched the way the left leg lifted and extended. The right leg got pulled up and folded in, but held horizontal. You landed on your left foot into a full run. Bullitt could feel along his muscles how to do that. When he came to fences or obstacles in cross-country, he took them like a high jump, essentially, slowing down to get into position, lifting his body up and over, then getting back into stride as quickly as possible. The hurdlers got a forward lift, really a part of the run, and their landing moved right back into stride. Leaning against the wooden rails, Bullitt felt his leg muscles trying it. His leg wanted to land on the right foot. He'd have to push off with his left. That felt right. He skipped the pole vault, sitting aside on the grassy hillside watching the sky instead. It was past noon, but nobody would be hungry until the meet was finished. They'd stop at the Dairy Queen on the way back to stoke up on hamburgers and milkshakes. Bullitt let the feeling of the hurdler's jump run down his legs, trying to get from his arms what they would be doing. He'd seen hurdlers like this before, he thought, but he'd never connected how he might use their approach. He wondered why, but only in passing. The only way to see if it worked was to try it, and it was a waste of time to think about it, why he hadn't thought to try it before. The cross-country started off flat, then went up a long, slow rise. Bullitt took the hill smoothly, steadily, every stride increasing the lead he'd gotten at the start. Over the top of the hill, taking the downslope as steadily and smoothly, he smiled to himself. It promised to be a lovely run, all 3 miles of it, and whoever thought to start it off with a hill would surely have some interesting ideas about how to continue it. The course branched off to the right for its 2.5-mile loop. Bullitt ran fast. He kept his eyes on the path ahead. They'd mark the course if it diverged. Fields and a tumble-down rail fence. He had to do some quick shuffling to get his left foot in position for the jump, and he wanged that ankle against the top of the fence landing. But when he came down onto his right foot and strode off without hesitation, he knew the technique would suit him. Splashing through the broad, shallow creek, the water icy, his foot slipping along the side of a buried rock, and he went down. He turned the fall into a start, pushed himself up off his ankles, came dripping and muddy out of the water, and ran. The markers took him straight across a field of tomatoes. The desiccated vines hung on tippy-shaped skeletons. He dodged around those that came up in his straight line, feeling his weight shift shoulder to ankle as he cut them as close as possible, running fast, arms pumping, eyes on the path ahead. He slid down into a gully, scrambled up the far side over fallen tree limbs, and emerged into a stand of pines, an island of trees between pastures. A few milk cows grazed in the field he ran past, beyond a barbed wire fence. The uneven ground rolled around his feet. The muscles around his back pulled and released, smooth as waves on the water. Another stand of pines and an unexpected fence, the red ribbons tied on either end. The tumbled wood stuck up at odd angles with a few nails coming out. It was low enough to run over, almost, without any change of pace, but he wanted to work on the hurdling jump. He approached the low obstacle at a dead run, pushing himself off with his left foot, reaching out with the right, remembering how the hurdlers had looked. He almost cleared it, Something hooked his left calf down to the ankle. Landing, he absorbed his forward motion with his right leg and brought his left knee up forward into the steady pace of running fast. When the paths rejoined, Bullitt increased his speed, up 2 beats. He pushed it up the slope, then relaxed down the opposite side, careful not to let the descent upset his pace or his balance, which was the danger in a downward slope, especially at the end of the course. At the final stretch, he ran full out, knees high, chest high, and didn't stop until he was well beyond the crowd at the finish. He stood straight with his back to them, looking over the oval track, breathing deeply. A good run. The coach came over to congratulate him and tell him his time. Bullitt nodded, wiping sweat away from his eyes. He went back to stand near the finish line. The coach said something to him, but he didn't hear it clearly. "Your leg," the coach repeated. Bullitt looked down. Blood was swelling out of a long cut on his left leg, the way blood did just before it started to really clot. His lower calf was streaked with dried blood. He went over to wrap a gauze bandage around it, one of the nails probably, not too deep, but it shouldn't have happened. You could expect bruises and surface lacerations on a good, tough course, but not a cut that would strip off a flap of skin. He tied off the gauze and drifted over to where the 3 blue windbreakers stood in a line, the coaches watching the top of the hill to see who would appear. The blonde one spoke in a low voice. "You didn't expect to beat him, did you?" "I'd like to have come a little closer." The head coach spoke crossly. "It's been over 3 minutes, and we've trained them on this course." "The kid's a natural," the blonde answered, moving his head to look at he man who he was talking to, which Bullitt brought into his line of vision. "Speak of the devil," he said. He was tall, muscular, and held himself with a military erectness. "Nice race, Tillerman. I was just saying I'd trade my right arm for the chance to give you some real training." Bullitt's chin went up as he clamped down on a surge of pride. A compliment was only worth what the man who paid it was worth, and he had no reason to value this guy. Who did he think he was, anyway? Thinking because he was a full-grown and had run himself. It made Bullitt angry, as if he needed training, as if he'd want this guy to train him anyway. "You've got a fence with protruding nails on the course." "We know our own course," the blue eyes challenged him. "It's illegal." The guy eyeballed him. "Is it?" he said. "Are you complaining?" Bullitt stared right back at him. "What do you think?" After some long seconds, he walked away. He didn't know what the subject of the low conversation behind him was, and he didn't care. A figure in blue shorts staggered to the top of the hill and began an awkward descent, legs too stiff. Another figure in blue crested, then a bunch, mostly blue with one red. They straggled down the hillside, not even on the path. The leader tripped over his own misplaced feet, rolled and stopped, stretched out. It took him a few seconds to get up again, and in that time he was overtaken by the man behind him. Coming down the hillside, one of the grouped runners pulled ahead, the guy in red, as if the sight of the finish gave him the strength to take another try. It was, from the color and size of him, Tammer. He didn't hurry down the hill and moved into the final stretch still running. There were 4 runners on the stretch, strung out and moving without any coordination, arms loose, eyes a little wild, mouths open, stride uneven. Tammer was too slow to catch them up, but he had his stride. As he came closer, Bullitt could see the muscles at his neck straining, and the bunching of those along his thighs. His whole body was wet with sweat, so that his skin shone as if it had been oiled, and his tank top stuck to his torso, showing where the rib cage underneath was wrapped around and around with bandages. As the runners crossed the finish line, they fell down onto their hands and knees. The 3 Acorn coaches moved over to them out of the way to pull them to the back of the crowd. There they left them, crouched on all fours. Tammer ran himself out of the way, as if his body was a machine running down. He fell onto the grass and lay there. The coach moved over to talk to him, then called to Bullitt, "Get a water bottle." The coach went back to wait at the finish line. Bullitt stood over Tammer, the plastic bottle in his hand. The big back heaved. "You feel okay?" Bullitt asked. Sometimes athletes did bust a blood vessel or have a heart attack, depending on the kind of strain they put themselves under. Young, apparently healthy guys. "I feel like shit," the muffled voice answered. Tammer rolled over onto his back. He opened his dark eyes. Tillerman, I should have known. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, it was to make an accusation. You white bastard, you knew it would be harder than the practice course. Lying flat, he clenched his fist against his hips. And he wouldn't tell us how bad it would be because then we wouldn't sign up. And if he didn't have the runners, he couldn't put you in the field. He looked up at Bullet, his anger controlled. It's been a long time since Whitey outfigured me. Bullet shrugged. It wasn't his problem. He dropped the bottle onto the ground by Tamer's arm. Tamer sat up and sipped from the straw. You knew it, didn't you? Save your breath, Whitey. I know you knew how bad it would be in a race. My question is, did you know the rest of us didn't? Bullet considered not answering, then decided to. People seem to think if they can run a practice, they can run a race. Born jackasses, Tamer said, glaring up at Bullet. You're no better. Anyway, I finished, Tamer said. Usually nobody does the first time, Bullet allowed him. It was the simple truth. Did you fall? There was no sympathy in the question, or in the glance at his leg. A nail on one of those fences. Blood was oozing through the gauze again. He'd have to rewrap it. They gave me no trouble, the guy announced. No trouble at all. How about leaving me be, Tillerman? I don't much like your company. Bullet almost grinned. Suits me. He went to rebandage his leg.